Hello, welcome to our first Quarantine video. We wanted to do a shout out to a couple of our sponsors at the beginning of this video and every video we're going to be putting out this month. We had a huge show of support from the community at large. So for those who really stepped up and went above and beyond, we made sure to give them a shout out on social media and all of our posts and just let them know, hey, we see you, we appreciate you, and we are making it very clear that you've stepped up to be an ally and a sponsor. So this week the video is supported and sponsored by Finger Lakes Community Health and by Thompson Health here in Canandaigua. And then Finger Lakes Community Health, specifically the office we did a lot of our work with, is over in Geneva, but they spread all throughout the Finger Lakes.
And so this week, Finger Lakes Community Health is actually sponsoring an event for Pride. They're doing their Finger Lakes Community Health LGBT inclusive bingo night. So definitely check that event out. It's posted here on our page. Show up and participate and support them. And know that these are two examples of really great resources where you can find affirming and inclusive healthcare treatment here in the Finger Lakes region. Thank you so much for all you have done to step up and support our year-round programming and, of course, Finger Lakes Pride.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye. Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Welcome to our very first Quarantine video of FLX Pride 2021. I'm Mitch. I use he, him, his pronouns.
I'm Amy. I use she, her, hers pronouns.
Tails is right here. He uses he, him, his pronouns. And my question of the week for this first week of Pride Month is, I know we're only 3 days in, but what has been the most exciting part of Pride Month so far for you?
I think my favorite part is that I just had one of my very dear friends come out to me right as Pride was gearing up because they wanted to be able to experience Pride this year as a member of the community, and it was really an honor that I was the one that they chose to come out to first. So I think that's my favorite part so far.
That's awesome. It's always so exciting to be able to welcome people into their first Pride. I remember how exciting mine was.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it was amazing.
Yeah. No matter where you are in your journey, Pride is for you. So for me, I was telling Amy about this. I decided to reach out to my family. We've stayed in touch really closely through the pandemic, and just let everybody know that, we've got all these awesome virtual events coming up that no matter where you are able to participate in our Finger Lakes Pride. So I was a little nervous about it. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little nervous. I sent an email to our family group chat and here's the calendar and this is just what I've been up to. I used our radio spot from yesterday, tucked that in there because it made me feel very grown up. And I just got really sweet, positive responses from a lot of my family members, and that means a lot to me because it's always a journey no matter what, and you never know how people are going to take it. And so that kindness and love and acceptance, it's just something that's really special.
Yeah, that's amazing. And, we've had so many people who've jumped on as sponsors and donors, and they've all been so excited about it. And every single person I dropped off donation baskets to were so excited. I had a couple of people who were in the same boat as I was with my friend having come out to me. A couple of them had family members who had come out and also wanted to experience Pride in the community for the first time. So we've got a lot of amazing growth that's going on in our community, and you wouldn't know about it if you weren't talking about it.
Yeah, and so we're continuing to get the word out and really communicate that. Even people I popped in on the first day of Pride, they didn't know that we were going ahead and doing this celebration. So we are super excited to continue to talk about it as we head into some of the more fun events that are coming up in the next couple of weeks.
Absolutely. But as promised, we're doing a video every single week. So this is our first Quarantine video of Pride Month, and we're doing it about our favorite moments in queer history. So it's going to be a little heavy. We both ended up choosing topics that were kind of heavy, amazing, beautiful stories, but just a little bit heavy.
Yeah. So the connection here is that we're going to be talking about the AIDS crisis here in America. That's a hugely important part of our history. Pride very much is what it is, and that message of community care and that hope because of what had happened. And for us as millennials, we are actually part of the first post-epidemic generation of queer elders. At our ripe old ages, we're already considered queer elders. And so for especially the young folks who tune in and who participate in our activities, this isn't something that we talk a lot about. And so Amy and I both independently and now together decided it was important to highlight some history from that time.
Yeah, so I'm going to tell my story first. I really like this one because it talks about how important allies really are. You know, when we're doing our Safe Zone training, we have a lot of people say, well, what does it actually mean to be an ally? A lot of people get nervous about the more loud-spoken allies who sort of make the waves, and they're the ones that you see really protesting and storming and, showing up at festivals, and some of them in some more severe instances will, handcuff themselves to legislative buildings. I always say, you don't have to do this to be an ally. I'm an ally to my community, and I will never do something that will make me think I'm getting into trouble with anybody because I can't handle that anxiety, right? So there are a lot of different ways to step up in being an ally. And the woman I'm going to talk about right now is a huge example of what it means to be an ally to our community. So I'm going to be telling the story of Ruth Coker Burks. This is a name that comes up on my screen every once in a while, and I'm like, ooh, I've got to flag that for a quarantine video.
Yeah.
And we just never got around to it. So what better time than now, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
So Ruth is actually known as the cemetery angel, which is, I think, it sounds very dark, but I think it's such a beautiful name, and I'm going to tell you why. So she's from Hot Springs, Arkansas, and she was born in 1959. So she didn't have the easiest childhood. Her father, I believe, had a stroke or pneumonia and died when she was just 5 years old. And so she was at home with her mother, and her home life vacillated between her being really terribly abused and her living in orphanages, even though her mother was still alive. So
she didn't really have a close family.
Yeah, it was a really rough situation for her. Her family's been in Hot Springs actually since the 19th century, and Files Cemetery is actually sort of their family cemetery, so they had all been buried there. So after getting into a fight with Ruth's uncle, Ruth's mother bought all remaining 262 plots because she was like, nope, your family's not being buried there. This is my cemetery now. Deal with it. So 262 plots were just bought up, and this prevented his family from being able to be buried there. So
petty.
Yeah. So when Ruth's mother died, she left the land to Ruth, and this is a really important fact that I will be talking about here in just a minute. So as an adult, Ruth worked as a real estate broker, which there's quite a bit of money in being a real estate broker. And this was also around the time that the AIDS epidemic really started getting underway. We know we saw spikes of it in like the 1981 area, and then it just got worse and worse and worse as time went on. There was also a lot of fear and bigotry around AIDS. There was a lot of not understanding what AIDS was, what that looked like. And actually at the time it wasn't even called AIDS. And we know that the fear and all the stigma really led to a lot of pain and a lot of mistreatment of the LGBTQ community, specifically gay men. So Ruth had been actually visiting a friend in the hospital who had cancer, and while she was there, she saw all these nurses that were really scared to go into this one specific room, and she had no idea what was going on or why. And it turned out that the patient had been diagnosed with AIDS, which was then called gay-related immune deficiency.
GRIDS.
Yep. So they had mentioned, that this patient is diagnosed with GRIDS. We're scared to go in there. No one really knew how it was passed. No one really knew what caused it. All they knew was that they were seeing gay men specifically spiking in this. So Ruth actually ended up visiting with the patient, and the patient said that his only wish was to see his mother. So Ruth reached out to his mom and even went so far as saying like, hey, I'm going to publish the real reason why this man died in the newspaper. Like so there were like not so much threats, but just sort of like his cause of death is going to be published. But the mom still didn't bite, still wouldn't come visit her son. And then when he did die, she refused to claim his body. So Ruth actually ended up taking over his palliative care, and only 13 hours later he died. So at the time, she was having a really hard time finding funeral homes that would claim his body to bury him. So she ended up having him cremated, and then she buried him with her father. So that was the first instance of her being what she would then later be known as the cemetery angel. So over the next 3 decades, she ended up contributing to the care of over 1,000 patients who were suffering from AIDS. She began receiving phone calls from hospitals and then later on from AIDS patients themselves. So this is when she really stepped up in a major way to the LGBTQ community. So Ruth and her daughter helped patients by taking them to medical appointments. They obtained medication. She would help them apply for assistance. And then ultimately she would help them arrange their funerals. And she also, I didn't realize this, she stockpiled a lot of HIV and AIDS medication because a lot of pharmacies weren't carrying it. It was really hard to come by. They wouldn't supply it. So she really stocked up on it so that patients would have access to this medication that was so crucial. And then the other thing that she did was that she would hand out safe sex kits in areas where she knew there was a high level of need because they were starting to learn that safe sex could prevent the passing of AIDS. So she did a ton of work around helping people who had it and also trying to prevent people from getting it. So I had mentioned earlier that Ruth was left 262 plots in her cemetery, and this is where it starts to come into play. She did a lot of work with patients while they were alive, but she also ended up burying 40 patients in File Cemetery because they had no one else that would help them or claim them. So File Cemetery became not only her family's cemetery, but also the cemetery for these patients who had died.
The chosen family.
Absolutely, which we know is a huge concept in the LGBTQ community. I can't imagine what it was like to have Ruth there as their guardian angel while they were going through all of this.
And thank God they had somebody, and what an impact that one person had on the worst part of so many people's lives.
Absolutely. So again, as a reminder, this was during the panic of the epidemic when AIDS was still seen as gay people's disease, and it was sort of seen as a punishment for living a homosexual life, and no one really knew a lot about it. So Ruth and her daughter, even though they were cisgender and straight, they were not immune to being targeted by the hate that was poured out. So Ruth and her daughter were shunned by the community, and twice the Ku Klux Klan burned crosses on their yards.
Wow.
Yeah. So there was a lot of fear and bigotry. Yeah. Right. So in spite of all of it, though, they did find a lot of solidarity with a community. It just happened to be the LGBTQ community. So when you think about Arkansas, you don't necessarily think about like gay bars. But it turns out there was a really lively LGBTQ scene there. So gay bars all over Arkansas would host drag shows as fundraisers, and then those funds would go toward getting medication, finding health care, covering the costs of all the care that was associated with having AIDS. And then Ruth actually also worked with an organization called Helping People with AIDS, which had been created by Norman Jones, who was the owner of a gay bar called Discovery Club. Discovery Club was crucial in helping to raise money and host those drag shows.
We've talked about this a lot recently, that like drag performances and gay bars, they have a whole different connotation to them now. And we're hearing from like some people in the community like that they don't understand why we have those spaces, or that they don't enjoy being in those spaces, and to each their own for sure. But these are the trailblazers who are the reason that we're still here, able to continue to tell these stories and make this history and look at what they did to help the people who aren't with us. It's a huge important part of our legacy to honor the work of drag performers through the decades, of gay bar owners through the decades, because they're the reason we're still here.
Absolutely. And they really rose up in a time where no one else was.
Exactly.
So when the Ryan White Care Act was passed in 1990, it made care for people with HIV and AIDS a lot more readily accessible.
Yeah, they figured out at that point, right, that it wasn't just a gay disease.
Exactly.
And, you know, there were those other methods of transmission, and so they were actually studying it.
So because she wasn't actually technically qualified for like work in the medical area.
That's not her licensure.
Right. She ended up having a really hard time finding professional work because she had realized that one of her passions was working with these patients. But she had a really hard time securing work once it became an piece of legislation. So, but she did serve as a White House consultant for AIDS education during Bill Clinton's presidency. It turns out she was friends with Bill Clinton for a while when she was younger.
Wow.
So that's really amazing that we had an ally all the way up there in the 90s.
Yeah. That's amazing.
Yeah. And so going back to that, doing the research and realizing how it's passed, she was actually sort of causing waves with the CDC and she was also causing waves with the National Institutes of Health, because they were finding out that these patients she was helping were living roughly 2 years past the life expectancy at that time. And they were like, what is this woman doing? Or like, what is happening with these patients that they're outliving the national life expectancy in a time where nobody knew anything about this? So they sent researchers out to investigate what was causing the extended life expectancy.
It's almost like proper care improves outcomes.
Almost. Some would say that's exactly what that is.
Yeah.
So by 1995, she had actually buried her last patient. With attitudes in the country improving for AIDS patients, she ended up moving to Florida. But while she was there, she had a really awful stroke. She lost all ability to read, write. She was having memory issues. She couldn't talk. So she moved back to Arkansas. But she worked really hard on gaining back all of her ability to read and to write and talk and all these different things. And then she continued her advocacy, this time turning it to advocating for 3 foster children who had been removed from school because there had been a rumor that one of them was HIV positive. And so they were taken out of that school just because of that rumor. So she rallied and she was like, nope, not on my watch. This is not what's happening. She was subsequently blackballed. And she had been offered a job. She had been working as a funeral home director in Florida. And so she had a standing job offer in Arkansas. And when they found out that she was advocating for these 3 children, that was rescinded. And then businesses would refuse to hire her. So last year, actually, a memoir called All the Young Men was published. And there are more talks about memoirs in the works. I know a couple of unauthorized like short movies have been made about her. So she still is an ally. She's going around the country speaking and really fighting still to be an ally to the community. So it was kind of a sad story that we had to have a person
We've got to have her come visit.
I know.
And you said her daughter was very involved as well. Do you know her daughter's name, or can you look it up? Because I definitely want to see what she's up to as well. Because 1995, right, when she buried her last patient and she moved to Florida, that wasn't the end of the story. We can tell that wasn't the end of the story. But that was not that long ago. That was a year after I was born. And so, you know, that ongoing work, and such a powerful example, too, of an ally using their privilege and using their network and connections to advocate for the change that was so critical on the federal level in a way that frankly, gay people weren't invited to the table to have those conversations. Having people from these communities sitting at the table and hearing those voices we know is so critical. And when that's not possible, having good, solid allies step up and find ways to make things better and to make that possibility more possible in the future. Like, we can poo-poo it all we want, but that's making the best of what you have.
Absolutely. So Ruth's daughter was named Allison.
Allison.
That's all I can find. It's just like a blip of a sentence of Ruth's daughter, Allison.
Okay.
Moving on. So Ruth and Allison, thank you so much for all the work you did for our community and the way you stepped up in a time when nobody was stepping up, because we wouldn't be here without that. And our community would not continue to exist the way that we do if it weren't for allies stepping up. And a lot of people worry that there's not space in the LGBTQ community for allies or for cisgender heterosexual people. But the truth is, there's always room at the table, like Mitch was saying. And sometimes we can't do the work on our own. We need those people to step up. And so for this mother and daughter to step up the way that they did and say, I don't care what you think about this, humans deserve rights and respect and dignity. That came at a time where most humans deserved respect and dignity unless we didn't agree with your lifestyle. And around that time, around the early and late 90s too, there were a lot of television shows really took that on. I know Designing Women took on an episode where an AIDS patient asked the sugar bakers to design a funeral for him. And
our fave, Golden Girls.
The Golden Girls, yep, they dealt with the AIDS crisis. So there was a lot, and that was especially a wave maker in 1990 when nobody was talking about it. And these two shows actually turned the dialogue on AIDS. And, there's that quote in The Golden Girls where Blanche says, like, AIDS is not a bad person's disease. It's not a punishment. It can happen to anyone for any reason. That wasn't rhetoric we were hearing then. So,
and that on national TV, on a show that was so popular, was, a bombshell of changing opinions. Yeah. And that allyship, it's all about finding the balance of with and for. So, for Ruth, a lot of what she did early on, she did for these people who, at that time, AIDS was a death sentence. We're going to get into this a little bit with my story. Not a little bit, a lot. We're going to get into this a lot. But then, organizing with those gay bars and with those drag performers. Allyship, it's all about that balance of that with and for, speaking up with and not speaking over or speaking for, but assisting for the good of these people. And she really is a stunningly beautiful example of that and the ripple effects that work has.
Absolutely. So this is why we talk about why allies are so incredibly crucial and amazing, and people who are willing to step up and do the work. There are no words to say thank you enough. So that is the story of Ruth and her daughter Allison, and how she became the cemetery angel and comforted so many men in a time where nobody would.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Well, so I've been sitting on this one since before we started this channel. I think I've wanted to get into this, and I apologize because I definitely wrote a little bit of a dissertation because I really want to do this story justice. So get comfy, like wherever Tails went, bring him back. But
Tails chooses you. You don't choose Tails. So
true. He's over there somewhere. Yeah. So like I already said, especially for the current generation, this isn't something that we hear in history class. This isn't something we talk about. And the person that I'm going to talk about today is someone who is not talked about in this context until very recently. We're starting to have more open dialogue about what happened with the life of Howard Ashman. So between 1980 and 1996, like we were just talking about, the acquired immunodeficiency syndrome, AIDS, was on the rise throughout the world, and here in the U.S., in many different communities, but most notably and most stigmatized were for homosexual and bisexual men who have sex with men, because that was kind of the scapegoat for the time for the entire issue. Like we talked about it originally being called GRIDS. And so we did a really thorough job as a country of honing in on the gay community as a scapegoat while simultaneously not providing that care or the change that those affected by this disease needed to be able to fight it. And it took a long time to get that funding, even to research it, let alone to work to improve outcomes. So by 1995, when Ruth, we just learned, buried her last patient, the CDC had recorded 500,000 cases of AIDS in the United States.
Gosh.
So this was an epidemic. And at that time, that was considered like the peak, because there had been things to change. But to give you some context, you know I love my statistics. To give you some context, the Center for Disease Control says that at that time in 1995, one gay man in every 9 was positive for HIV or AIDS, and 1 in 15 would ultimately lose their life to the disease.
Wow. I mean, you hear about the epidemic all the time, but you never put it in that context.
Right, because you don't hear those numbers. And so that's why I thought it was important to share that. By this time, by 1995, the person I'm talking about today, Howard Ashman, was already gone. So Howard Ashman was born on May 17th, 1950 in Baltimore, where he grew up. There's a documentary about him now that came out on Disney Plus just last year for Pride Month called Howard. And his sister Sarah talks about how much he always loved to tell stories. And she was always his best audience. Like, he would do it for her to entertain her when they were home alone. So she talks about how he created a land in his bedroom once and took her scene by scene and told her the stories. And he was going to take her to this place that was unlike any other place they would know in Maryland. And it was him having a great time and bringing you along on the journey. So Howard became involved in the Children's Theater Association with the support of his mother, Shirley, and even played the role of Aladdin in the Children's Theater when he was a kid. So his mom really fondly remembers him. He would put on shows in the backyard and take her bed sheets to put up stage curtains, and he would cast all the kids in the neighborhood, and he would make them put on makeup. Like, he would do
go
this.
big or go home, right? If you're going to do it, you got to do it right.
Right. So from a very young age, this was his passion. This was what meant something to him. His father, Ron, wasn't super fond of the idea of him taking dance lessons, and when he asked to take dance lessons, he took him fishing instead and tried to get him into baseball.
If I had asked dancing and my father had put me in a little boat and made me go fishing, I would have lost my little mind.
Yeah. To his credit, when he asked him if he was having fun, and he said, no, I'm really not. And his dad was like, I'm not either. And he changed his mind.
That's awesome.
So
fishing and dance are not the same.
Two very different things. But so his hobby as a child and all as he was growing up was putting everything to music. He liked to write poems and plays and lyrics. And so even his laundry lists, he would musicalize. So he was actually the first in his family to go to college. He started at Boston University and then headed to Goddard, which was considered very super hippy dippy. They didn't have grades. And it was very super liberal school. And while he was there, he went to Tufts University, also in Boston, for a summer to do a theater program. And there he met Stuart White, who was his first partner. They both got scholarships from there to go to Indiana University for grad school in theater, and they set up their home together in 1971, so we're talking 2 years after Stonewall. So the relationship was, of course, a secret. They were roommates.
Right.
So Howard was studying for his master's in playwriting, and I made a note of this because I think this is a really cool point. For his master's thesis, he did a rewrite of the Hans Christian Andersen classic, The Snow Queen. What do you know about The Snow Queen? Yes. Imagine if he had still been around.
Would have been incredible.
But described as super fierce and lively, and then Stuart described as boyishly flamboyant. The two of them actually became a team. So Stuart wanted to direct and Howard wanted to write, and so they became this powerhouse. And they did all these things together, and they were described as being so charismatic that people just were drawn to them. They wanted to create art with them. They wanted to be with them. And so following their graduation from Indiana University, they went to the place to be, which was New York City, to really focus on their dreams of theater. Initially, Howard had to take work doing some copy editing just to pay the bills. He had a really hard time because they didn't have connections. They didn't have a network. So breaking into theater was hard. And he almost went into publishing instead of theater. but he got to work on the Mickey Mouse Club scrapbook as a copy editor, and Disney actually flew him out to Disneyland while he was working on that to do some research for that project. But at that point, like that trip, he remembered as reigniting his passion for the storytelling piece and really missing the storytelling piece. So he and Stuart decided to start their own theater. So they actually bought an upstairs loft that was on Lower Fifth Avenue, which was like a ghost town at the time and known for being a really scary neighborhood. And it was above a donut shop. So they built a black box style theater. We have one in Geneva, if you're wondering what that looks like. And it had a 99 seat capacity. And everyone thought they were nuts for doing it, but it was a place where they could do whatever they wanted. They didn't have to conscribe to what was happening currently on Broadway. They could create their own art the way they wanted it to be created, and they did. So Stuart and Howard started to differ on what they wanted in life. Stuart often called Howard grandma because he really was very domestic and he just wanted to work, while Stuart wanted to have fun and he wanted to go drinking and be really adventurous. And so they ended up splitting up. Stuart went away and Howard just put his head down and kept right on working. So in 1979, composer Alan Menken got a call that a guy named Howard Ashman was taking their mutually beloved Kurt Vonnegut Jr. story and hoping to stage God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater, and needed help composing the music. He wanted to write the lyrics himself.
Oh, wow.
Because he was not a composer. He was a lyricist through and through. So they sat down together with Alan having the intention of helping him out, assuming he didn't know what he was doing with writing lyrics. And Howard didn't back down from what he thought it should sound like, what his vision was. And so early on, Howard said that writing lyrics was the most fun part of doing this stuff for him, and he would rather do that any day. So Alan said that there was only one rule to their creative sessions, and that was they would not leave without a good idea, a good lyric, a good song. So Kurt Vonnegut actually came and saw a rehearsal of the show at their little theater.
Oh my gosh, can you imagine?
I would lose my mind. I would panic, yeah, for sure. But then after he saw it, he loved it so much that he helped facilitate Warner Brothers coming on to bring the show to Broadway. But it didn't do well on Broadway. It was not designed for that commercial consumption. So Howard always preferred smaller shows, those small places with the element of surprise, the intimate closeness to the audience where the audience gets to kind of participate in the storytelling.
Completely changes the dynamic.
Yeah, exactly. And so for his next project, he decided he wanted to do a really small cast. He thought back to when he was 14 and he was staying up late watching TV, and he decided he was going to tackle the classic horror spoof Little Shop of Horrors, which was actually the first time they ever did a monster story on stage. Like, that was not a thing anyone else had done at the time. So everyone told him not to do it and that it was a really bad idea, but he wanted to do it and he was committed to it. And he said that the first thing with any adaptation is to make the story coherent. Musicals need fairly simple and direct and convincing plot structure. Adapting is like reading a book and telling a friend about it later, saying, "This is what struck me about this thing I saw." So Alan came with him onto that show, Alan Menken, and taught him about writing. And Howard taught Alan about writing a show with the intent of a certain style. And so what they were aiming for was the dark side of Grease. Like, they wanted that doo-wop feel, but they wanted it to be like that spooky monster vibe. So Howard's agent hated the idea, hated the music, didn't want them to do it at all, but said the only reason it was going on was because they owned their own theater and Howard could put it on. But Howard went ahead, and the documentary, Howard, actually has an awesome clip of Howard himself sharing the way that this was a classic musical set up, the way he structured it. It's just with the twist of like the context and the setting and the tone that made it more fun, that made it different. So Howard actually ended up with his choice of 30 offers to take it to different theaters.
Wow.
And so he chose to let it go to the Orpheum. So what he had done with that show was so unique that in 1986, a film adaptation of his musical version was made. Steve Martin, isn't it? That's the version I think we remember seeing. And he actually wrote the screenplay for the movie adaptation himself as well.
Wow.
So he was nominated for his first Academy Award out of that film. And I had legitimately no idea when I watched that movie that it was connected to him. I remember when I watched this documentary for the first time, I was shocked because I didn't know he'd written it. I had no idea. But like, it's that style. You can see the connections when you watch it. So Bill Lauch met Howard about this time. He was an architect that moved to New York City in 1980, and he was at a bar in the Village, referring to Greenwich Village, home of Christopher Street and the Stonewall Inn, where gay culture was growing and really thriving at that time. He locked eyes with Howard, and they immediately clicked. So Howard called Bill up a few days later and invited him out on a date. And so Bill recalls him asking, "Have you ever been to the Grammys?"
What a date.
Yeah, a first date.
I can't imagine what Bill must have thought.
Right? But, I mean, beyond it being really cool, the connection was immediate, and Bill became like that true, loyal, stable life partner that Howard had been looking for. So Bill says that the real commitment came when they decided they were going to build a house together out of the city up in the Hudson Valley, a home that they designed together. So if you think about this, we're in a time way before gay marriage was even remotely being talked about as an option. That's quite possibly like the most intimate thing that a gay couple could have done. They built a home together. They made a commitment to be together. It was a place to connect their current lives and to build their future. So Bill and Howard had met in 1984. They built their home together in 1986, which at that time we were 5 years into the rising HIV/AIDS crisis. So New York was already changing for them, which was part of why they decided to go upstate. More and more friends and loved ones of theirs were dying from what was still being called the gay cancer in a lot of like the public conversation. And so Howard's sister recalls in the documentary a phone call from her big brother letting her know that his first partner, Stuart, had just shared he had been diagnosed with it.
No.
The gay cancer, and they called it as such because at that time they hadn't even gotten to grids yet. That this happened very, very early on. So everyone that knew the two of them that was involved with the theater in the beginning, they all thought Stuart was going to get better because this was for them, the first time someone in their circle had this disease. But
there were at that time, I know there were a lot of symptoms that were very like flu-like.
Yeah.
Right. So there wasn't a lot of research done about it. There wasn't discourse happening about what actually was happening or why it was caused or, how to take care of it. So a lot of people said, it was very flu-like. I felt very sick, and then I just kept getting sicker. And
then it would turn into pneumonia, and that we know now is part of the AIDS complex. And that's the typical course of how the disease would run when it was completely untreated and unfettered, which was
most often the case.
So Howard realized that Stuart was going to die, and at that time the fact that they had been in love became more important than the fight they had and the breakup. So he was visiting him pretty regularly before he died.
So was Stuart still in New York at the time?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep, they were both still in the city. He also had a really close friend named David Evans who also died around the same time of AIDS. So Howard took his feelings about this terrible time and doing what he did, he took that fear and loss and he wrote a song to reference the grieving gay community of a place in New York called Sheridan Square. That's in that little Greenwich area. And so I have a link to that song that I'm going to drop in the, bless you,
Excuse me,
in the description. I was just listening to it in the car on my way over here, and like he literally lists off the names of his friends that had already died at that point, and talks about, you know, if anything good can come from this, like a phoenix, it'll rise from there, from Sheridan Square. Like it's powerful stuff. I was gonna like play a clip of it for this, but I think it's best to listen to it separately because it definitely made me cry.
Well, and that's an incredible tie-in because we chose Phoenix symbolism for Pride this year because, you know, in the middle of a pandemic and shifts in laws and legislation and the way tides turn, you know, we wanted that visibility to be there of like, yes, things happen, bad things happen all the time, not just to the LGBTQ community, just in general. I mean, we're still going through a pandemic, but we wanted that symbolism to be like, we're still continuing to rise out of this junk or this really hard time or
destruction.
Anything. Exactly.
Yeah.
We're rising out of these ashes and becoming stronger and more beautiful than before with each cycle. So,
yeah. So, I mean, and that's when I was writing this, like what I don't think we necessarily understand so well is the feeling of knowing that your friends would be gone tomorrow and that your community was falling apart because I said all the time in the beginning of COVID, you remember, this is not the first time our community has done this. This is the first time, though, that we were talking about it. The government was doing something. There was effort made to keep people safe. So what I think we do have a little context now is what it's like to be afraid of a disease that spreads so rapidly, to not know. And so what's important to remember about the AIDS crisis is that the public wasn't talking about it, and then when they were, it was to demonize the gay community.
And in a big way, by the time the community was talking about it, it was too late.
And the government initially wasn't doing anything to help. Not funding research, not funding relief, nothing. And many people were demonized by their families, like completely thoroughly, like the people that Ruth stepped in for. Like that was a very common trajectory. So Howard was a storyteller, and you can kind of see his work from this rise on start to carry this subtext of what was happening in his life. So his next project was writing a musical based on the beauty pageant movie Smile, where Jodie Benson auditioned and was cast in that show. She was a huge fan of Little Shop of Horrors. She had it on LP, she talks about in the documentary. Wow. And she recalls Howard being super attentive and sweet, and he wanted an actress who could sing, not a singer who could act. Like he was very invested in the theatricality of it. So she knew she wanted to work with him and was really excited for the opportunity. So they were trying to move the show onto Broadway, and moving it made the producers, David Geffen and the Schubert organization, really nervous. And Howard got told, no, we're not going to move forward with spending this and putting it on Broadway. But he didn't give up. Howard and his co-writer, who was Tony Award winner Marvin Hamlish, blazed on, and they found other producers to fund it. But when the show ended up not getting good reviews, Marvin just like disappeared, and Howard was really down, and he'd been going through all this loss. Things were not going good. He decided he wanted to leave the city and step away from like this live theater piece. And that is where Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was the head of the Walt Disney Studios at the time, stepped in. So he invited him to come to LA after having heard people, including David Geffen, actually like complimenting him and saying, you got to talk to this guy. And so he actually called Howard in the middle of Howard's family's Passover Seder and was like haranguing him to come to California. And so like the significance of Passover. Like his sister talks about during the Passover Seder, you're waiting for Elijah, and she recalls like Howard for some reason getting up and answering this phone, and like what a fateful moment that was. So Disney at that time had a real set of stinkers. Like the movies they'd been putting out did not do well. And so the animation department actually got moved off of the studio lot, and they were working out of a warehouse in like a series of trailers over in Glendale.
Oh, wow.
When Howard got there. So
a little bit different today, huh?
It's a little bit different, and it's certainly different to what he was expecting to go to, having loved Disney previously and visited Disneyland for that copy editing project. But when he first came, he was working on some live action scripts, including writing one called I, Tina, about the life story of Tina Turner with Tina Turner. Super cool. But then Howard, who had always felt like an outsider, found his place with the other outsiders that were in the animation department. So Howard recalled growing up on Pinocchio and Peter Pan, Snow White, and immediately felt drawn to the art form that is the Disney animation and the way that stories are told there. He really loved the idea of a musical and the music, meaning that the story was moving along, and that's what the Disney animation whole thing is. So he actually brought Alan Menken out to California with him, his composer, remember, to work at Disney Animation along his side. So the first script they worked on was The Little Mermaid. Howard had the idea to redesign Sebastian the Crab's role with like an actual islander as that part and giving it that accent and those references to like reggae music, that calypso style music. And so Samuel E. Wright, who voiced Sebastian, actually just recently passed away at the age of 72. I think he passed away last week.
Oh, wow.
So very recent. But he received an Oscar alongside Alan and Howard for his performance as Sebastian in the Best Original Song, Under the Sea, in 1990. When they got that Oscar that night, and I'll come back to this in a little bit because I'm going to go back to the production, but that night was the night that Howard actually told Alan that he had been battling in secret with AIDS himself. So when working on the film, Howard highlighted that a character has to have a clear want, and for Ariel, her want was to be a human. So he wrote Part of Your World, and he brought Jodie Benson to the studio to audition as his way of making up to her for the failure of Smile. And so she is very famous, having been Ariel, and he's the one who brought her.
Wow.
And he brought Alan, too. So Jodie imitated Howard's line reading in those songs. She trusted his guidance, his vision, and it became a really incredible soundtrack. So
I mean, it's one of the most classic ones when you think about the classic Disney.
Yes. So he wrote music not just for the sake of singing a song. He wrote music to push the plot along and incorporating it as a really important element of telling the story. Disney actually wanted to fire him while he was working on this film because he pushed back so fervently when they wanted to cut Jodie's Want song, which was Part of Your World.
Can you imagine Little Mermaid without that song?
Right? But at the time they thought it was too slow and that the kids were going to get bored and that it didn't need to be in there. And there was a lot of like clashing of personalities because he was committed to seeing things through with his vision. In the end, it stayed in the film and became one of the highlights. We know that. So I want to note here too, with this film, Rob Minkoff was the character designer on this film and was working on Ursula. You've heard me talk about this so many times. I'm so sorry. Who had been noted, like they were trying to do kind of like a punk rock Joan Collins thing. So like really skinny, really drawn, super dramatic. But Rob decided he was going to do something a little different based on a fellow Baltimore-raised performer, Divine, who is the drag queen stage name of Harris Glenn Milstead. So Howard zeroed in on that design, loved that design, and that's The one that got used in the film.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So we've talked about queer coding in the Hays Code many times on this channel, and if you've attended one of our trainings, we highlight
Always
that as well. But that is that baseline, in brief, a decades-long trend based on law where gay characters could only exist in films or in television if something bad happened to them. So queer coding is the act of deliberately making a character based on gay stereotypes, but never identifying them as such. Mm-hmm. And a particularly insidious and very, very common at this time form of that is the way that a lot of queer coded characters were the villains, mm-hmm. like Ursula, and later on Jafar.
And Scar.
Yeah, this was very, very common, especially within Disney. So it's something that continues today, and now we see more positive queer coding from Disney, but it's still not the representation. It's relying on the stereotypes without the authenticity. Mm-hmm. And
well, we're going to talk about later on this month, we're going to talk about representation and queer representation in media. It'll be interesting to break that down.
Yeah, so we're going to come back to that convo. I was really hoping, I wanted to know what Divine actually thought on the design on the film, but he actually died in 1988, 1 year before the film premiered. So the link is there, but I don't know if Divine even knew that he was the inspiration for Ursula.
Really?
Which I thought was really interesting because we've talked about this so many times.
Yeah, well, and it's such common knowledge.
Yeah, and so to line those dates up and realize that he probably didn't even know. So when I get to heaven, that's what we're going to talk about.
First question.
Bring me Howard. Howard and Divine, let's talk. So if you're interested in this topic, there's this super awesome essay written by Kyun Kim that is titled Queer Coded Villains and Why You Should Care, that I'll drop a link to in the description, out of Rutgers. So in that essay, they say that media continues to queer code villains through stereotypical depictions of traits and behaviors in order to reinforce traditional gender roles and to equate deviancy from the norm with villainy. But if you think about it, and you think about the time, right, when they're still calling this the gay cancer, and that's the rhetoric, this is why it became so easy, so natural, and such a trend to villainize queer-coded characters, because they're being demonized actively in society. Mm-hmm. So, and these characters, you think about them, they're glamorous, they're dignified, they're clever, they're smart, but these traits are painted in shadow. They're painted as evil.
Because it's not that they're smart, it's that they're conniving. Mm-hmm. And it's not that they're glamorous, it's that they've stolen that.
They're vain.
Yep.
Yeah. And all of this is done in contrast to the main characters, which are those typical heteronormative.
Very humble, very sweet, very... Yeah. I mean, even their coloring is so light in comparison to Scar, Jafar, mm-hmm. Ursula, where it's blacks and purples and, lime green and all of those really dark colors. So
it's very intentional, and it is mm-hmm. very much to send negative messages about people that are not in line with those norms of those main characters.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So yeah, definitely check out that essay. I read it very briefly, but it was a good read. So I'll drop that link for you. But in the summer of 1988, Howard went to see his doctor. He had noticed white patches on his tongue and in his throat, which they knew was thrush, which is one of the early tells of HIV. So his doctor wanted to run a test for HIV to see if he was positive. But Howard, as an employee of the Walt Disney Company, refused, because if he were to be tested, he was going to lose his medical insurance.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So instead, the doctor found a workaround and checked his T-cell count, which is a measuring of the blood cells that kind of indicates the state of a person's immune system ability to respond to outside pathogens. is my understanding. I'm not a scientist. And the T cell count was so low that he and his partner Bill were completely shattered because they knew what that meant. So he would go home from the studio while working on The Little Mermaid and receive treatment at the home of his lifelong friend and coworker, Nancy Parent, who kept him on his feet every day. She was working on the script for Little Mermaid, and so she was really, like, he would receive IV medications in her living room.
Oh, wow.
Like, she was taking
Talk
care
about
of.
another ally.
Yeah, absolutely. And she's still living. She works in Disney Publishing now.
Okay.
And has for like 24 years. So she's still around, and she's in the documentary quite a bit. But the rest of the Disney team, including the company president, did not know what was going on. Like, Nancy knew, but nobody else, because the fear was Howard would lose his job.
Right.
And so people knew he wasn't feeling well, but no one had any idea how sick he was, or that it was the death sentence of AIDS that it was at that time. And so...
Well, yeah, because, I mean, once you found out that you've got it, you've got just a few years.
It's a countdown. Yeah,
That's
at that time, that's how it was. We've made a lot of progress, and it's not that way now. People have lived long and healthy lives with proper treatment. But at that time, yeah. And so he and his partner, Bill, had to carry this in secret. Which I can't even imagine. So Alan Menken actually recalls how frustrated Howard became when he couldn't things done right at this point. Like, he was angry. He was really sullen and frustrated and cranky all the time. And Alan had no idea, thinking it was something he was doing wrong, that it was because Howard was preemptively grieving because he couldn't share what was going on with his collaborators, and he knew time was running out, and he wanted it done right. And he wanted to make his art while he could. Around this time, they also started work on Aladdin, which was a huge passion project for Howard.
Because he had been in it.
Exactly. Yeah, it meant so much to him. It was one of his favorite stories. And so he actually walked in the door with every song for that film written. Lyrics, he knew what the music was going to sound like. He just needed Alan to actually write it down.
No.
He knew what it was going to be because he knew exactly what he wanted, and he was just hitting his stride at this time and really coming into mastery of his craft. So no one else worked on those songs, which is unheard of in this kind of setting. Howard was a powerhouse who just made Arabian Nights, Prince Ali, Friend Like Me, all of it. He had it ready to go. But Jeffrey Katzenberger, the president of the studio at the time, hated it, put the entire film on hold.
Why?
He just didn't like it. And it was a difference of creative opinions, and so they shelved it. Yeah. So there was Howard. They flew him down to Orlando doing the press junkets for The Little Mermaid while he's still taking daily intravenous medication. So at Disney World, there he is for work when he's so sick. They're expecting him to ride the rides because he's there for work. And I can't even imagine.
It must have been so hard.
And he couldn't tell anybody what was going on. But on that trip, though, he was also able to see the brand new in 1989 Disney character hit parade, which was also called the Zippity Doo Dah Parade for my Disney people who want to look this one up and watch it because it is on YouTube. I checked. Which included for the very first time in the parade characters from The Little Mermaid on their very own float.
Oh, wow.
And so Ariel's in her mermaid tail on the rocks, and it's so cool. And even Ursula, they have Ursula in the background, which is pretty neat because you don't see her very often. Flounder leads the whole thing down the street.
That's so cute.
But according to John Musker, who was the director of The Little Mermaid, Howard told him later that he had burst into tears when he saw that float coming down Main Street, USA, because he had the feeling that this would live on after me. And Musker didn't know yet. He thought he was just saying, oh, how cool, I created this thing for Disney. He had no idea. He had no idea. No one did. And so Howard, remember, it was that night at the Oscars in 1990 for The Little Mermaid that Howard first shared the news with the one he was closest to, his friend Alan Menken. So he told him then that he was ready to let him know that he was going to die, because after the Oscar win, he knew that his friend Alan was going to have a good career. And he knew he was going to be taken care of. And that's what made him ready to share it with him, was that he knew his friend was going to be okay. So Nancy Parent confirms that really, till the point there was no going back, Howard didn't want people to know. He really feared the judgment, the criticism, and so much as said that he had hid it to great personal detriment because he didn't know how Disney would react. He said, here I am, a gay man working on this movie for kids. I didn't want to be fired. Jeffrey Katzenberger recalls him sharing that more than anything at this point, when he's finally starting to let those in the inner circle know what's happening, he just wanted to make these movies. He cherished telling these stories, and this was what he wanted to do with whatever time he had left. So he was going to go on working. So Jeffrey decided to put Howard and Alan, which were the dynamic duo, onto a new project at this time, Beauty and the Beast. But at that time, Howard was so sick that he couldn't travel to California, where all of the actual animation was happening. And he candidly shared that with Jeffrey. And so Jeffrey made arrangements for the filmmaking to come to him at home in New York.
Oh, wow.
So the cover was that Howard was a diva, that he was using the clout that came with his Oscar win to call the shots and demand people come to him, because Howard still didn't want the whole team to know the truth. And the truth simply was that Howard Ashman was dying. So the team in animation was not happy. Like they recall being really cranky and so annoyed to even work with him.
Yeah, I mean, I bet I would be.
For making them come all the way across the country. But Don Hahn, the producer, recalls that Howard would come in every morning with fresh donuts for the whole team. And he continued to have that frustrated, fiery temper with them when things didn't go according to the vision he had. So that kind of reinforced the idea that he was just this diva. But he knew what he wanted. So the intro to the film was originally non-musical, and Howard said no, and he took it, and he wrote Belle to musicalize this moment of Belle, like waking up, leaving her father's cottage, and walking into town.
That's one of my favorite songs from that movie.
Right? Like, it's such a good one. And so he was actually afraid to send it in to Disney as a demo, but he did so alongside the other one he wrote right away, which was Be Our Guest. And they stayed pretty much exactly how he drafted them. So the latter, Jerry Orbach and Angela Lansbury, a full chorus and a full orchestra in Be Our Guest, of course. And they recall that Howard never gave vague direction. He was specific and really focused. He knew, I think, that this was going to be his last chance. So he really gave 100% of what he had built and all of his skills over the course of his life, while he was staring down that he was going to die at the age of 39.
Oh, gosh.
So he's only had about 5 or 6 good hours a day, and he spent every single one of them working on this film. So as they pulled Aladdin off the shelf, again, to take a second look, he split his time and he was focused on making that what he could as well. At this point, he was losing sensation in his fingers. He was losing his voice off and on, and his ability to see. These are neuropathies that come with the progression of untreated AIDS. So he watched while his team stripped away everything he had done to build the soundtrack for Aladdin. Like, they literally took it all away. And there's like a hand scribbled note in the documentary that you see that he wrote on the side of a script that they were wrecking him, ruining him, wanting him neutralized, which I think he took very personally.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because he had put so much of himself into that. Was his passion project, like I said.
Mm-hmm.
Around that time, he wrote the mob song for Beauty and the Beast, which his partner Bill sees as showing his world pretty clearly. So trying to imbue some point of view, he says, subtly, not politically, but to cast a kind of light on certain topics. And so there's a lyric in that song: "We don't like what we don't understand. In fact, it scares us, and this monster is mysterious at least. Bring your guns, bring your knives, save your children and your wives. We'll save our village and our lives. Kill the beast."
Wow.
So Bill calls that the perfect manifestation of people seeking this scapegoat for the trouble, identifying a villain, identifying a group to blame, and wanting to destroy it, which is what was happening to the gay community during this time in mainstream American culture.
Yeah, I mean, hearing that language and those lyrics used now in a different context makes it so much like darker and more of a like, I gotta take a step back.
Yeah. Bill recalls very clearly, like, the ignorance. We already talked about this today, the societal belief that even it was believed that just having casual contact with someone with AIDS was enough for someone to contract the disease.
There's a lot of fear around it.
And people really believed that only degenerates got this disease, only people that deserved it, quote, got this disease. So what can you do then, thinking about this, but view the beast in a different light? I mean, truly, I grabbed this on the way out of my house. This recently resurfaced. This is a little beast figurine that was on my 4th birthday cake. And I was like, this is going to be a rough one for me. So he's sitting here. But that's why Howard sunk so much into the redemption of the beast, right? Beauty and the Beast can never be taken away from the context it was written in its time, which was the AIDS epidemic. I want to note that Howard's sister Sarah didn't believe that Howard interpreted or intended the story to take this route because of his personal journey, but she really recalls her brother's incredible capacity for empathy and saw himself, when he was writing these characters, as putting himself in their positions and writing for them from that place. And she says that he dealt with human issues, human thoughts, and in this final process, he was really looking at, well, what is a beast and what does it mean to be human? And so, I mean, all across the film, right, like with all of the enchanted people who lived in the castle, the concept of being human is a big piece of that.
Well, and there's like, it's such a driving, motivating factor to regain your humanity and not lose that.
So Howard would be hospitalized off and on while he was working on this movie at the cost of spending time with Bill as he began to decline. Bill became his carer in the home that they had designed for their future. And he says, "And now we had no future together, so then I'm left with the remnant of it. I think we probably had our goodbye long before he was actually gone." Towards the end, his colleagues recall him becoming gentler. The anger was gone. He just knew in those last sessions when he was working on this movie, calling in from his hospital bed at St. Vincent's, that his time was running out. So the team went together to visit him at the end and to say their goodbyes months before the film was actually completed. So March 14th, Alan Menken recalls a dream where he was visiting Howard at the hospital, and Howard was like, help me up. And he went to help him up, and he was weightless and wearing a black robe. And then when Alan woke up, he looked toward the clock, and he found out later that was right about the time that Howard passed.
Wow.
So Howard's partner, Bill Lauch, was invited to accept the Academy Award for Best Original Song in 1992 that Howard won for Beauty and the Beast. This was the first Academy Award that was given to someone who had been lost to AIDS. And he was nominated one more time the following year in 1992 for Friend Like Me from Aladdin, Disney deciding in the end to take the gifts that he had left, the stories and songs he'd made for that film, and put them in because he loved it so dearly. And those are the songs that we know. That's the movie that
and those
we
are
know.
the songs that are just so classic and crucial. Like you can't even imagine that movie with other songs.
And it's being revitalized for a whole new generation now with the stage adaptations and the remakes that they did. All three of them have been recently remade. And I told Amy when I walked in the door that I cried in my car on the way here because the community theater for the summer program signs are up around town because they're going to have auditions, and the shows they're doing this summer is Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin, and it's the Disney versions, and that's the way that we now tell those stories, is the way it was written. So I really wanted to close with the words of his sister Sarah, who was his first and lifelong biggest fan and still is. She says in the documentary that what we got was just the tip of the iceberg. God only knows what he would have done, but it would have been spectacular. So she actually maintains a blog on howardashman.com to commemorate his work and his legacy. And so she wrote 7 years ago on his birthday a post that I just pulled some pieces from to share. Although Howard's work has become his legacy, I don't think that was what compelled him. I think that what compelled him was as simple as the need to create. It's something that all imaginative people feel, along with the need to run away from the compelling need to create and just sit on a beach and watch the world pass. In Howard's case, he needed projects. Without them, he could get caught up in all sorts of minutia, making stuff up for the pure pleasure of making stuff up. I remember a long summer where he worried amusingly about the state of Jane Pauley's hair. Her styles changed with the ratings. Another fallow period of writing was spent working on baking the perfect Sasha tort, much to the pleasure of his foodie family and friends. Once he was at Disney, Howard had the confidence he needed and all the toys a creative person could want to go full force. Animation unbound him from the real-world necessities of stage, which was his first love. Then Howard got sick, and he thought it would all end. He thought that the creative options, the toys that Disney provided, the collaborations with animators and directors, and his composer, Alan, would disappear. Remember, at that time, many people still believed that they would catch HIV from casual contact. They were frightened, and very little was being said by the government or anyone else to dispel that fear. Howard was in a race all of his life, and to the day he died, a race to create one more song, one more character, one more moment, one more piece of theater. I don't know if Howard ever had a feeling that he would die young. I didn't. I thought he'd live forever until the day I found out he was dying. But I do know that well before the AIDS crisis, Howard was in a hurry to get to the next thing. There are people who say that this sprint to the end is a form of denial, and maybe that's true for some. And as I said in the start, they may feel a need to keep working that comes from fear of failure and of poverty. For them, a fear that even outweighs the fear of death. But I think it's more than that. Like the people in the Times article, Howard had a visceral need to connect to others through the work he created. I think that meant not only the ultimate audience for his work, but the collaborators with whom he worked. Whether it's a painting, a picture, writing a song, or penning a poem no one will ever see but yourself, nothing takes a person out of himself more fully than the act of creating. So it stands to reason, doesn't it, that when the world and your future seem dim and sometimes intolerable, going into that place of creativity is a salve and a saving grace. It never occurred to me to suggest that Howard stopped working when he got sick. I doubt it ever occurred to him either.
Amazing. Yeah. Well, and it just shows the absolute resiliency of the community, and I like that Sonic, who was a therapy dog, hopped up here at the very end. But it just goes to show that, you know, the resiliency and the rising like a phoenix and not being held down even at our darkest moments is such a message of hope to hold on to.
Mm-hmm. And Howard and what he did can continues to inspire so much of what Disney does and so many other people. Alan Menken, of course, we know went on to continue to do amazing work for them. And people who have worked with Alan, I think, have come to know Howard through what Alan learned from Howard, including, and this is the quote that first came to me when I was thinking of this, Lin-Manuel Miranda, who came on to write lyrics for Moana, your fave.
My very favorite.
There's a lyric he wrote. He's also, one of the greatest lyricists of our time. Imagine if the two of them had gotten together. Imagine.
I can't even begin to think about what that would have been like.
But he writes a lyric in Hamilton that, what is a legacy? It's planting seeds in a garden that you'll never get to see. And I think that's what Howard Ashman did with what he gave us in the little time he had. So I'm talking his career with Disney started in 1986 and he died in 1991. We're talking about 5 years.
And that 5 years lives on in so many ways.
And we don't talk about this because so many people in the queer community felt the need to keep it close to their chest because of the judgment, because of the stigma. Like, I'm not sure Howard would be super comfortable with us talking about him in the context of being a gay man publicly, because that wasn't an option at the time. And to now be at the point where Disney has added the fifth key of inclusion to their policies. Disney is doing more than ever before to celebrate Pride. I don't think he ever would have imagined it. I don't think he ever would have imagined it.
I mean, it's hard to imagine it now. And
there's still progress to be made.
Yep.
We're certainly still waiting on a few things, I think, in regards to seeing positive gay representation in Disney movies. But it's remembering that the growth is still happening, and this is why it matters, and this is why Pride matters, and highlighting these things and telling these stories is so important.
Absolutely.
Right, Sonic?
He's just hunkered in for his history lesson.
Yeah, with his little... Do you want to show everyone your
With his little progress bow tie?
You want to show everybody your bow tie?
Sonic.
Mr. Fancy?
Here it is.
There it is. Fancy boy.
He and his brother Lennox are both wearing their Progress Pride flags bow ties.
You good boy.
Yeah.
What
a nice way to end such a heavy...
Gotta have the puppy cuddles.
Yeah. But, so this is just one of our videos that we'll be putting out this week.
This month, yes.
This month. Maybe Sonic will be making more visits. Who knows? But stick tight with us. It's not going to be as heavy moving forward. But these are both just so... They're stories that need to be told. And we can't live in that fear of being too heavy or, making waves, because progress isn't made without weight or waves.
And this is our history, and this is the reason that we're here. Doing what we do.
So we'll bring the therapy pup on.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, I love you.
Oh, you're so cute.
Oh, I love you.
All right. Thanks for spending over an hour with us as we talk about history and my dog. And we'll see you next week.
Yeah, lots of awesome stuff is happening this week. Check out the Pride calendar, FLX Pride on Facebook for all of our events. We can't wait to see ya.
See you next time. Bye.